U.S. schools have come a long way since desegregation, but they still have a long way to go, especially as it relates to language equity and opportunities for students in public schools. It's estimated that by 2020, 1 out of every 4 students in U.S. schools will be Latino, and this presents an opportunity to build on the rich cultural heritage of these students and to build on their rich heritage language in order to make more equitable experiences not only for them, but higher quality educational experiences for all students. I was born in El Paso, Texas, and grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas. And in this region, all of this territory was once Mexico. And people of Mexican heritage will proudly tell you that they did not cross the border crossed them. This land became part of the United States after the Mexican-American War. My grandma Simona was born in 1915, and she attended Mexican schools, and most of her life she spoke only Spanish. I was born in 1971 and went to school in South Texas, and most of my life I only spoke English. Following the end of slavery in Texas, Mexicans experienced much of the same discrimination as blacks under Jim Crow law. Same loss of liberty, same loss of life. In one of the biggest ranches in Texas, over 800,000 acres, it's said that there's a mesquite tree for every Mexican that was lynched there. And my grandmother ends up attending a Mexican school until the 3rd grade, when then she is forced to help support her family and work. And these Mexican schools were notorious for providing an inferior education, oftentimes poor facilities, poorly resourced. But my grandmother really internalized that as somehow her own fault. She said to me when I was young, she said, "Es que era muy burra, mija, no podía aprender inglés." The reality was she was denied schooling because she didn't speak English. And this doesn't really come into question until 1947 with the case of Mendez versus Westminster. This is when they finally began thinking about the rights of Mexican students in schools. And in this case, the federal court ruled that the separation of Mexican students into remedial Mexican schools was both unlawful and unconstitutional. And this is a really important court case because it lays the groundwork for Brown versus the Board of Education. And in fact, the NAACP had joined this case represented by Thurgood Marshall. And he goes on, of course, to represent the NAACP again in Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregates all schools, right, in the United States. Despite, desegregation, my family really struggled in school. To understand that even after desegregation, Mexican students still suffered from language discrimination. Students were punished for speaking Spanish in school. Sometimes they were classified as learning disabled if they couldn't learn English. My own parents were spanked for speaking Spanish in school. And they were brilliant people, but school was not a very safe place. But my mother almost dropped out of high school, and my father, even as an English learner, managed to graduate from high school, but didn't really see a future for himself in higher education. He decided instead to enlist in the Navy during the Vietnam War. And he felt it was both his rite of passage as a man, but he also understood it to be his duty as a U.S. citizen. He returns to a country after his tour of duty that is completely steeped in anti-war protest and to organizations that are still largely discriminatory against Mexicans. And in 1971, when my parents have me, they make a decision. They decided that they were not going to teach me Spanish. They did this really because of the humiliation and discrimination they faced in schools. They suffered and did not want me to suffer. By the time I'm in high school, Brown versus the Board of Education is already 30 years old, but still I happen to go to a high school that's almost entirely African American and black students from poor and working class families. And even within that schooling system, there were stratifications, segregation based on language and language acquisition. If you spoke standard academic English, you might find yourself at the top of that stratification. If you were an average student of language arts, you found yourself somewhere in the middle. But if you were a speaker of Spanish as your first language, or you were limited in your English proficiency, you were almost entirely segregated from the rest of the school population. I was lucky enough to find myself at the top of that stratification. I was an honors student. I was a student who was easy to teach. For whatever background knowledge me and my peers had, we were regarded as intelligent. And this intelligence then entitled you to more. more challenge, higher expectations, and more help from your teachers because they believed strongly that we might actually have a chance to get into college. And it continued a kind of inequity in schools, those of us who were able to get a more quality education than others. And this is not to fault my teachers. They were amazing. They shined on us. They nodded to us. You are special. You are different. The fault really was what a system that determined upon whom they would shine and for what purpose. I was accepted to Georgetown University and graduated here in Washington, D.C., and that's when my entire world turned upside down. First of all, I was no longer an honors student. I was a struggling student. It was hard for me to keep up with the volume of reading that we had. My professors said I had inferior writing skills. This from a kid who made all A's in high school. And I really struggled every single day, especially because when you're the first person in your family to go to college, you're not just failing yourself, you're failing everyone in your family who couldn't go. Your uncles, your aunts, your parents, and your grandparents who were only schooled into grammar school. But the second rude awakening was the status of language in this new environment. I was surrounded by international students, students who their entire lives had spoken a language other than English, and they seemed emboldened by that ability. They were considered talented for it. Even US students had gone to schools of immersion to learn French and Spanish. And this, while people in my own community, poor and brown children, were either stripped of their heritage language or demoted socially and academically for speaking it. And this kind of lit a fire under me. I really had to ask why. Like, why were we ever separated in the first place? And what could I do about it? I think I became an educator largely in part due to this experience. And in my experience, I decided that I was going to be a public school teacher. And in those first years, I was really haunted by several questions. And those were, why don't we not only think that all students can learn at high levels, but that they can do that at more complex levels, right? If they're together rather than separated. And secondly, why can't we use the rich culture and heritage of students and build upon it for higher, results? When I had my own child, I also decided that I was going to teach him in English and in Spanish. I am now the founding principal of Mundo Verde Bilingual Public Charter School, and we are a community of over 500 students. We're considered one of the most diverse schools in Washington, D.C., and students are engaged in learning in fun but demanding ways. They do lots of research and inquiry, they investigate essential questions, and they consult with experts in the field in order to learn as much as they can. And they express their learning in beautiful ways outside of the school to the larger community. And they do this in English and in Spanish. It's really been years in the making as an educator, but when I think about my grandmother, it's been over a century in the making. I had possibly what was one of the longest conversations I ever had with my grandmother right before she passed, this because I had finally mastered Spanish. And in that conversation, she told me about the Mexican schools, and she told me about her heritage and our heritage. And really, it was the first time I understood, right, the struggle that she had been through. I really hope that she and my mother and father and all our ancestors shine down on this work at Mundo Verde, really helping us to create learning environments that build strong ties between students, that build upon the empathy that's part of our core curriculum at Mundo Verde, that really gives students the opportunity to shine and creates less divide in schools and more unity. Thank you.